ahead, Shannon.
And the potential of somebody joining the crew.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the last session of a three-part speaker series on gender, sexuality, and human rights. My name is Rachel Loewen Walker, and I'm the Sallows Chair in Human Rights with the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. And I'm joining you from Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Nakota, Ojibwe, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I want to invite you to say hello. Let us know where you are from in the chat. And just an FYI that today's talk is being recorded. It'll be made available on the College of Law's website following the talk so that you can just enjoy the conversation. So what I want to do first is introduce our moderators for this panel. I had the pleasure of teaching the Sallows seminar this term, and we focused on gender, sexuality, and human rights. And Ciara Richardson and Rory Erickson were two students in that class. They were very keen to support this lecture series and have been helping me all the way through in connecting with our speakers throughout and developing questions. And so I'm really pleased to have them here today. And this talk, this really important conversation, was something that they identified as a conversation that needs to continue in our community. And so it has been a pleasure working with them on this. Ciara is a third-year law student, and this summer she's working as a research assistant with Professor Patricia Warwick. And Rory is also a third-year law student, and this summer will be working as a summer student at Classic here in Saskatoon, as well as supporting the Indigenous Summer Law Program as a teaching assistant. And both of these wonderful students have agreed to help me out and work as research assistants for me this summer, which I'm really looking forward to. So I invite them to take it away.
Thank you. So on April 23rd, 2021, Global News proudly announced an historic moment in Saskatoon. The City Council voted to ban conversion therapy with the credit of our mayor, a majority of our City Council, and the many voices within the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. And a special thanks to Grosvenor Park United Church for originally calling us to task. Conversion therapy is a traumatic and isolating form of oppression for members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. This method of therapeutic treatment is inherently harmful and detrimental to mental health and serves no benefit to the individuals undergoing this type of therapy. And preparing for this final talk as part of the Sallows Speaker Series on gender, sexuality, and human rights, we wanted to keep the conversation going and emphasize the continuum of progress in which we currently find ourselves located. In our forward momentum towards a world that provides support, protections, and care for our communities, we also find opportunities for reflection into the spaces we have created with those intentions at heart. The Prohibited Businesses Bylaw prevents any business in the city of Saskatoon from engaging in or operating a business that is involved with conversion therapy. In this process of reflection, we grew curious about the fact that it only applies to businesses, a feature which is shared in bylaws of this type in other cities and nationally. What remains possible from this enactment, and what are its limits? With these questions and concerns in mind, we are keen to invite community leaders to weigh in on the continued conversation about conversion therapy and our developments within progress, or in the words of Jose Esteban Munoz, an ever-approaching horizon of a future society that is being evoked and addressed at the same moment. I will now turn this over to my colleague, Ciara, who will introduce our wonderful guest for this afternoon.
Thank you, Rory. Sill Bishop is a Calgary-based litigation lawyer practicing mainly in the areas of corporate, commercial, and construction disputes. She received her Juris Doctor from the University of Saskatchewan in 2013 and is excited to virtually return to her alma mater for this important discussion. Jill is a gender non-conforming lesbian and uses female pronouns. She underwent soft conversion therapy as a youth, giving her a unique perspective on this topic. Jill and her wife have two sons, ages 3 and almost 1, and they keep her busy and focused on making society kinder and safer now and for future generations. Ben Borne is a communications professional on paper, but a relationship builder at heart. Over the years, Ben has nurtured a passion for using strategic communications to create inclusive, generous, and responsible communities. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Canadian Mennonite University and a diploma in public relations from the University of Victoria. In his spare time, Ben is an active volunteer with the International Association of Business Communicators and president of the Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan Board of Directors. Notably, Ben is Canada's first Indigenous certified communication management professional and is the co-owner of Symmetry. Lastly, we have Mayor Charlie Clark, who is passionate about Saskatoon. He believes our history of innovation, problem solving, and collaboration can position us as a leading city across Canada. His approach is centered on the belief that partnerships among groups with different perspectives can offer the best solutions to the challenges being faced by cities across the world. Prior to serving as mayor, Mayor Clark was the Ward 6 city councillor for 10 years. And this last element of his biography, in my personal view, highlights his greatest achievement. He is married to Sarah Buehler, who is a wonderful law professor here at the University of Saskatchewan. We are so lucky to have her. And they have 3 children, Simon, Ben, and Rachel. So we have a number of questions for our panelists. And the proposed plan of action today is that Rory and I will pose questions just open to all panelists. And then we invite you each to answer just according to your own interests and expertise. And we would encourage all panelists to engage with one another throughout today's discussion. So just starting here. We are proud to be part of a city that has implemented a bylaw against conversion therapy, as we know that other cities are still working towards this. That said, we also know that there's always more work to be done. So now that we have a bylaw prohibiting conversion therapy, how might that be enacted or enforced, and what challenges might there be in enforcing this bylaw?
I'm happy to jump in first. Hello, everyone. As Ciara said, I am joining you from the Treaty 7 territory of the First Nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika First Nation, the Kainai First Nation, the Piikani First Nation, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Region 3. I can speak a little bit to what's in place in Calgary. That's been in place a little bit longer than the conversion therapy ban in Saskatoon. The website for the city of Calgary is quite informative in terms of putting measures into place for enforcement and the like. There's a 311 call line that you can call into to make an anonymous report of business practices violating the conversion therapy ban. I wasn't able to find any news reports or anything of that nature, which I think would probably be generated if there was enforcement related to the ban, but there are at least measures in place, which I think is a step in the right direction. And I know we'll talk about some parameters on enforcement later, but I can share that from Calgary's perspective.
Yeah, I can. Oh, who wants to go first?
I'm happy to hear from you, Ben, and then give my perspective.
Sure. Yeah. So, as a member of the 2S LGBTQ community and a person of faith, that's kind of the perspective that I bring to the table. You know, I can say with certainty that the conversion therapy ban is a step in the right direction. You know, I went to Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg. And I was elected as the student council president, and it was kind of publicly known that I was the first openly gay student council president in this institution. And this was kind of a big deal. And alumnus felt compelled to write me a letter and invite me to a conversion therapy type scenario. And I, you know, and it was kind of operated out of a counseling clinic, right? And, you know, if you know me, I laughed my face off for a minute because I was like, wow, I can't believe this is actually happening. And then I was really disheartened and really discouraged to get this letter, right? And I was very fortunate that I was part of an institution that could shelter me a little bit from this, right? And they kind of worked with the alumnus. But, you know, I think kind of in that light, I think there's lots of perspectives and takes on this conversation, both from, you know, the religious community and from the kind of the general public. So, you know, I think for some folks, there's a perception of what's the point, right? It's unfortunate for some groups that they'll see this as this policy as kind of virtue signaling or an attack on their autonomy, and others this is like welcome, right? It's a really strong sign of what kind of community we want to be a part of. So, yeah, I think I just see like there's some challenges here in terms of how we're going to negotiate relationships with people around what this policy's implications are. But yeah, I'm open to hearing more conversation on this question for sure.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, having gone through the response originally to Governor Park's challenge to the city to make a clear stand on this and to develop a conversion therapy bylaw, to sort of figuring out what that meant for our city, what is the right legal approach to this, or what can we learn from places like Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver that have implemented. I'm actually really happy that Jill's on this call so that we can hear a little bit more about what that has looked like. For me, as that discussion emerged, I think it in itself became a real education for our community about the reality that conversion therapy has and continues to have a real direct impact on people's lives, and has been extremely harmful. Has led to people needing to undertake years of recovery and addressing the damaging impact that it's had on their lives. And as a city that is really, I think, learning to understand what it takes to walk the talk of how do you be a city where people are welcome and that we want to pursue. I'm never going to say we're there, a place where people are valued as they are, and that we don't support or endorse activities that somehow try to force people to change or feel ashamed of who they are or their gender identity. Now, the question, though, also points out that there are challenges in the enforcement of this, and we knew right off the bat that this is an imperfect bylaw, and really, as the process went on, I guess since this is a legal sort of panel, the legal kind of parameters and framework for this has been a big part of it, that the city ended up really needing to, on the advice of our city solicitor. I see that we have at least one member of our city solicitor's department, Rachel McCaig, on this call. So I am not the expert on this. So if I say something wrong, I'm hoping somebody will correct me. But essentially, that we really needed to sort of work within the language and the framework that had been developed in Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver, but also under the umbrella of the language and the framework that the federal government had developed. Because if every city establishes its own definition, its own wording, its own specifically definition of what conversion therapy is, then it becomes a lot more possible for constitutional and legal challenges to be brought forward, and you end up with this kind of unclear terrain when it comes to these things, and so that became a big part of the discussion, and so as I learned, and I reached out to the mayors of Calgary and Edmonton, as Jill has confirmed, there hasn't been a lot of direct enforcement in other cities around this. I think what we've done is establish that this practice is not okay, particularly if there's a business that's undertaking this practice, that the rules are clear. And I think it was mentioned earlier when it comes to a church, the sort of process for being able to deal with that issue, it would start with a complaint, and it would be an opportunity for dialogue and discussion about what to do, and that's where I think the enforcement becomes more challenging, but it would be an effort that we would undertake to work through a process with the complainant and with the institution to try and to address.
Thank you. So if there's nothing else to add for that section, I think looking at all these complexities and how the challenges are and enforcement. I was curious about whether or not you believe that a bylaw is enough in circumstances when we look at other municipalities or we look at laws across the country. For example, Bill 6 is one of the bills, a federal bill. I'm looking at that, but the benefits and limitations of municipal bylaws and even bills in that sense, does it provide us with the teeth needed to intervene in instances where conversion therapy is taking place?
I only have one comment on this one. You know, I don't foresee anyone making any business applications anytime soon for a license for conversion therapy offices in Saskatoon. So I mean, it's a very discrete practice, which we'll probably touch on a little bit later. But you know, is it enough in the sense that it says, you know, what kind of city we want to be and promote what kind of community that we want to have here in Saskatoon? Yes. Practical application, I think that's a really tough call. Maybe Jill might be able to speak more to this, or Mayor Clark. I think in a very specific setting, you know, in a very specific setting, it would work. But you know, in kind of the broader sense, you know, that federal bill will play a big part in this too. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that for sure.
Yeah, Ben, I'm glad you raised that. As a member of the queer and gender diverse community, I certainly think the symbolism of it in all the major cities, in Western Canada at least, that's been huge for me personally. The difficulty when it comes up, for me, I realized that I had undergone soft conversion therapy as I prepared for this because it was so, I don't know, it's quite subversive. It's praying away the gay. It's building this lifelong kind of shame through your religious upbringing about who you are, and leading you down a path of wanting to change that. And it's something that I think people, whether minors or young adults in my case, they enter conversion therapy voluntarily, despite the realities of the harm. And I think there's a complexity that Ben has raised and Mayor Clark has touched upon. It's, at least I can speak with respect to experience in the evangelical Christian community of, as soon as you're learning or being prohibited from doing something within what you view as part of your freedom of religion, it's viewed as a kind of persecution. And there's a huge retaliation to that, despite, and maybe fueled by modern science and taking a contradictory view of the belief, and something of a lack of credibility, a lack of maybe willingness to learn. I can only speak to my experience, but that was what I saw on that side. And I think that presents a hurdle for enforcement, but at the same time, these types of steps are really important for the community, really important for education, and hopefully cause people like me who maybe even didn't realize they had undergone this type of conversion therapy to think about who is now experiencing that harm and how can that be prevented by me now, knowing that it is so harmful and that people are maybe not educated, maybe not willing to learn, but I think safeguards still need to be in place.
Yeah, I would certainly echo in our discussions about this what Ben said about, you know, a city using a bylaw to try and address activity like this is pretty, you know, all we can do is regulate to some degree so-called business activities, and under this bylaw, a church or a business, you know, could be argued to apply, but it doesn't lend itself to a very nuanced sort of address of the behavior or the specific practice that in some cases can be, as you said, quite subtle, and that the federal legislation as a more overarching, you know, behavior or legislation that is more directly addressing a practice or an activity is a necessary, I think, overarching step, because on its own a bylaw is going to be quite limited in what it can do. The benefit, though, is that by having this discussion as a community, it educated a lot of people who don't have the direct lived experience of being subject to conversion therapy and realizing the harmful impacts it had to become more aware of how predominant it is, how in the sort of different contexts it can happen, what impact it has on people's lives. And I would say even for myself, like it's opened my eyes to what that means for citizens living in our community and who are dealing with the impacts of that. And so in itself, you know, that's part of the process of social change, I think, is that even if it's an imperfect bylaw, it helps to sort of move these issues and start other conversations. And so I think that it's not an end in itself, I think, is kind of what the question is does this solve everything? And I would say that I'm aware as the mayor that by passing conversion therapy, we have not sort of addressed, you know, the issues and the impacts of conversion therapy, or the need to continue to do work to address homophobia, transphobia. But it helps us become more informed in how we do that. And that has, I think, certainly been beneficial.
Great, thank you. That leads me actually into the next question, and all of our panelists have touched on this, that one of the biggest concerns around present day conversion therapy is that it is rarely called conversion therapy. It's often soft sold through more palatable language, often in religious or therapeutic settings. And everyone here has spoken about that. And so our question is, how do we intervene in these instances, and what strategies might be in place in terms of ensuring that these practices are addressed?
I'm actually interested to hear about this, because as the mayor, I think it's something that, how much do you have the mayor, you know, directly getting involved, or the city getting involved? Obviously, this sort of, as has been identified, you know, there's practice, you know, there's religious practice, and then there's governance, and this sort of falls in the in-between. And so we have to think carefully about what the right way of addressing this is. And I do think that there continues to be even as this debate unfolded, that it's clear that there are some bodies, some churches that are practicing forms of this that are not called conversion therapy, but that are having an impact. And there's a need to have more of a reckoning about what that means and what the impact is. And some of that is not going to happen through enforcement of bylaws. We have to find other means to sort of build a bridge, you know, between the people involved. And that was definitely one of the lessons that came out of this experience for me. But I don't know exactly what the right components of that bridge look like. But I think the next steps, you know, we can work that out as a community.
You know, someone who's still like an active member of a church here in the city, you know, I think there's a good number of progressive churches that recognize the damage that these activities can cause, right? The real harm of it. And I think they would be happy to be included in the solution or as part of that conversation. You know, you can't always leave the church to sort itself out because it'll never get done. But but I think there's some aspect of you know, I think the more progressive churches would love to have conversations around, you know, how can we include the solution, and that might ignite some sort of ecumenical or interagency effort to you know, start holding some other churches accountable. There's some very interesting websites and accountability websites out there for affirming churches that they can participate in, you know, different kind of internal organizations, I would say, I call them, you know, in faith organizations. But, you know, I think there's some ways we can do that. You know, I'm very fortunate to come from a very accepting Mennonite church here in Saskatoon, and that deeply affirms all people in their journey of faith. And, you know, for some reason that still shocks some to us LGBTQ people. You know, it's hard to rationalize the reconciliation of faith and sexuality, but, you know, it is possible. And so I think some churches need to do some work on and promoting in this space to help kind of counteract some of those conversion therapy type messaging that's out there. So I think we just need to, you know, Mennonites are known for being the quiet in the land, and maybe it's time we just need to not be so quiet, right? But yeah, at least from the faith perspective, that's how I take that question on.
Yeah, that's fabulous to hear, Ben. As someone who didn't have the accepting perspective in my religious upbringing, I love to hear that that's happening for you. And I'm hearing that more and more from people growing up in progressive religious communities, because I know the kind of community and the love that can be there, and I think that's wonderful. And those faith-based communities should be fostered for that reason. And so I'm really, really happy to hear that that's been your experience. And I really just want to echo what you have to say. I think the more progressive faith-based communities maybe could build a bridge between some of the differences. As I was saying earlier, I think sometimes there's a hurdle with a lack of credibility that's created by different viewpoints, and maybe some of that can be bridged where views and beliefs do align and find similarities. For me, I think it comes back to education overall, and some of it maybe is driven by a fear of differences, obviously an ingrained view of what is sinful and what is not in some cases, but I think education is a big part, and navigating where that can come from to be effective is probably one of the bigger hurdles here, unfortunately.
I guess I just want to mention too, I'm very grateful for the courage of the people who did come forward and you know, to publicly speak in a city council hearing about the experience of conversion therapy, or the members of like Amanda Guthrie and Jack Saddleback, who, you know, came and spoke on behalf of about Saskatoon, and in our case, actually the meeting where we debated this, I think it was a 14-hour meeting. So everybody in this item came at the very end, and so everybody had to wait. And there was a lot of anticipation, and I think, you know, some emotion and also wrestling, you know, leading up to it. But I learned how deeply personal this can be as a topic. And so I also had a chance to talk to members of faith communities that had concerns. And in the role of mayor, it's actually, there's a lot of privilege and it's an interesting place, because you can talk and you can, you know, understand and at least hear from the different perspectives within a community about how you see an issue. And I did hear a willingness and an interest in learning more, understanding more, you know, what could be done to address conversion therapy. I think the challenge we have in a way is there's sort of a broad part of the community that understands and agrees the most coercive forms of conversion therapy are wrong and should be banned. But then when you get into some of them, I think we've used the term softer, or, you know, forms, that's where I think it becomes important to sort of be able to understand, okay, what are we talking about, and how do these things impact people, and what's a safe, I guess the reason I brought out, you know, people having the courage to come and share this, you know, what's a safe way to have that conversation and build that understanding, because a political process does not lend itself necessarily to those harder, more honest conversations. But I've also seen in different settings where, under the right circumstances, there can be change can come through having the right opportunities to have that dialogue. And as Ben said, there's more. I'm also part of the Mennonite community, and I've seen in some of the places where there's been breakthroughs. And Sarah, you know, Ciara, you talked about my wife Sarah, who's my my bridge into that, I agree with everything you said, actually, about her being the best thing and that's happened in my life. And so there are spaces where I think there can be some of that learning built and developed. And so it's just a matter of figuring out how to move them forward as a community.
Thank you. I think really to the tone of where these capacities lies, and especially with the bridge building component of things, I think there's a curiosity around how there can be this leaning into or learning from various institutions, like thinking about schools, for example, and the structures that exist there, thinking about faith-based institutions, the limits to each, what is able to be mandated, what can be prescribed or required of certain areas. Especially even the federal government, that bill specifically being proposed has the limit of being to a business only. So again, we have these limits and capacities. I know Mayor Clark, you've spoken to, the challenge of what are the capacities of municipal government, what can happen there, what's possible. And so where do you see that sort of interplay being successful? How can there be this bridging occur in a meaningful way? Because it is something that can become so contentious, but it's an opportunity for community building, really, in essence.
I mean, I feel like that's exactly what I was. I'm not sure what to add to what I've already said on that, but I think it's the area as a community that we have to sort of sort through together, but then also put those stakes in the ground, where there's an opportunity to make sure that it's clear what our values are and where we stand on different issues, so, but how much does the city intervene in the space of education or faith or those things? It's something I think you need to kind of do it as a community as opposed to just sort of trying. The city government is generally, we can establish our values, our participation in things like pride and our own measures within our city government to build education and awareness and expectations and practices and policies. But we are also careful to go around and tell other jurisdictions what to do. At the same time, we can play a role in convening and establishing norms for our community, so again, I'm interested in hearing what others say on this.
Yeah, I think this is a tough cookie. What capacity does the government or municipal government have, right? Churches, private faith-based schools, they all operate with some regulatory freedom, right? And internally inside all these organizations, no matter your stripe, they all interpret scripture differently, that form a different ethical framework from the other. And because of that, and because of how churches have this in the world, not of the world thinking, it'll be really hard to affect change in these settings, from a policy perspective. And I think, as Mayor Clark said, it's definitely have to be a community effort, an education effort. And we can do so many things inside our organizations, to educate, to train, and the churches are going to have to come and meet us halfway too. I think some of them at least to help be part of the solution. So yeah, I'm uncertain in terms of how municipal or federal governments can have much say in this. I mean, maybe there's a window of opportunity when you start playing with charitable statuses, but I don't know if I'd want federal government wants to necessarily do that. But yeah, I think we can just keep seeing these leaders stepping up and providing leadership and helping us imagine what kind of city we want to be, right? That's inclusive, that's generous, right? And I think that's truly remarkable. And I think that's what these policies can do.
I don't really have too much to add, but Mayor Clark, it's wonderful to hear that faith-based communities were asking questions, wanting to learn. I stand corrected on my somewhat jaded approach to that. To add to what Ben was saying, think, yes, definitely the regulatory frameworks, the freedom of religion, and the human rights issues make it complicated. Bill C6, and if the criminal code amendments go through, will be fairly comprehensive as in terms of stakes in the ground for parameters on what's permissible under the criminal law. Very difficult to enforce, very difficult to locate offenders. I guess I come back to grassroots change with real people sitting down and really maybe talking about the harms. It sounds like the debate that you had and those brave individuals who spoke about the harms they experienced, I imagine that type of thing goes a long way to educate on the humanity side of things and try to avoid those harms and the terrible mental health consequences that they can have. And so I think these types of changes at the federal level, at the municipal level, hopefully at the provincial level, get those conversations started. And I'm really happy as a member of the community to see that these conversations are happening, and wanted to take this opportunity to thank you two for hosting this and the University of Saskatchewan for enabling us to have this discussion. I think it's really important.
Thank you, Jill. And likewise, I was just about to applaud our panelists for humoring us on basically a list of questions that the bulk of which surround a lot of hypotheticals. And I realized that must have been challenging, and you're all really rising to the occasion in a way that I feel you've gone above and beyond. And so here's another one. I have another hypothetical, I guess. In terms of each of the panelists' unique experience in sectors, and they certainly are, and we're hearing that with answers to each of these questions, and we're so grateful for that, for the diversity in this panel. Would you determine it to be plausible to have systems in place wherein, like I say, whistleblowers could anonymously come forward when there are instances or perceived instances of conversion therapy taking place within, say, a church or workplace or a school? And if so, what might that look like? What might an investigation process look like? And again, I just want to say how much I appreciate all three of you in really rising to the occasion in terms of these hypothetical type questions.
Yeah, I think a whistleblower system is a very interesting idea. Had I had the resources, this resource 10 years ago, and I received that letter, right, at CMU, how would I have changed? Would I have reported this business? Because, they were trying to solicit, me to come and participate in conversion therapy, right? May have turned out very different, right? But I'm also unsure, exactly how big, municipal resources can be poured into something like this. I think conversion therapy is a huge concern, but is it more helpful to put those resources into community nonprofits that are, actively helping 2S LGBTQ youth instead? In terms of investigations, there's just more questions that get raised with this question, right? I'm not sure how, this would take shape or what that would look like or who would facilitate it, right? I can't really foresee just yet what kind of outcomes we would get from this, and whether a conversion therapy practitioner would ever be open to accountability of any kind, right? And I think that's, hopefully when you do an investigation, you can get some sort of accountability. And I don't know what that accountability would look like, whether they're open to receiving that. Are they even aware that what they're doing causes harm, right? There's so many questions to be asked on this. I can't really, I have lots of mixed feelings, but I'd be happy to hear from Jill, where they have the hotline at Calgary to hear how that might play out.
Oh, tossing the tough question to me. I like it. I mean, I don't know how that line is working. I would like to investigate that now that it's really piqued my interest. Sitting here as someone who probably more than 10 years ago had some soft conversion therapy, this question actually made me think of whether or not I have some sort of an obligation now to report the individuals that were involved in. And I was thinking along those lines of maybe it is something that those individuals who are wanting and undergoing harmful therapies retrospectively will be reporting the individuals that are performing the therapies. I think certainly in terms of a practitioner or a counselor or particularly a registered psychologist, any enforcement, I assume, would have to be accompanied by reporting to their regulatory body, which I think would have a lot of teeth to it. In addition to, I think individuals would be a pretty significant fine, and corporations even more. Practically, when I have clients dealing with regulatory problems, the money hurts. And so if there were a whistleblower system in place, again, that people were wanting to utilize, I think that it could be effective. I don't want to say in necessarily making an example of people, but perhaps using it as a teaching opportunity more than anything. Yeah, and I guess from my perspective, I've never, conversion therapy for a lot of people is really, really traumatic. For me, the trauma came from the shame associated with the background teaching that led to the conversion therapy. And so it's kind of all interwoven for me in terms of where the harm comes into play. But kind of targeting the background beliefs, the shame generating teaching, it gets into a gray area of religious freedoms in some senses. But my hope with these types of bylaws, these types of criminal code amendments, maybe it makes people start to think more critically about what they're saying and what they're doing and what they're teaching. And enforcement will be just another opportunity to visit that and to bring it to top of mind for members of Saskatoon, for members of Calgary. And so that faith-based communities are examining what they're teaching in their communities and what harm it might be causing. Inadvertently, I think, in a lot of cases, but it causes harm. So those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I feel like I have to certainly approach this one cautiously because I don't exactly know what, the legal parameters would be. I mean, right now our bylaw inspectors don't necessarily have specific training in how to investigate, what it does or doesn't sort of amount to be conversion therapy. And so if there are some cases where I think it would be more easy to do that, in terms of a practice or a business. And if in areas that would be more gray zone, that's I think the question that we will be working and talking to other cities about, and also waiting on the federal sort of, because I think the first step once the federal legislation is in place would probably be the federal rules. Now, I wish I had the presentation from Dr. Wells, because he in front of me, because Dr. Wells had also kind of laid out the relationship between the federal and the municipal when he presented on this matter to council. I just don't have that presentation in front of me to recall. So there are definitely legal nuances in terms of how could some sort of a whistleblower, who would be responsible for the complaints, who is holding the accountability, that would need to be worked out, that if I speculated too much on, I feel like I could go down the wrong road in terms of what our area of jurisdiction would be. But I think we're learning, and that's how a lot of bylaws and approaches that cities take are, we can evolve and adapt if we find something can be or needs to be adjusted, and certainly learning from other cities as well as they go through these experiences. And that was the context that the passing of our bylaw is that this is something that if it requires adaptation or higher or less levels of enforcement or those types of things based on experience, then we just have to revisit that and work through it. Yeah.
I think that educative function is really a critical one, especially looking at what's possible for acknowledging identities or developing language that might otherwise be absent. I think if somebody is recognizing anything, as Jill, as you've mentioned, identifying an experience that you may not have otherwise had labeled or placed within that same zone of understanding at the time, that later on you're able to adopt that understanding. And so looking at that, being able to understand the harms of conversion therapy and being able to understand the complex sort of interweavings of shame, or looking at whether it's taking place in its sort of expressive form. Are there things that that we could be doing in our workplaces, in our schools, in our institutions and communities to be able to educate about the conversion therapy ban, to be able to have understandings around language and the like?
I feel like one of the things that we need to do is to address some of the term was used earlier, but virtue signaling arguments that come up, and some of the dynamic that we're in right now, where it can become very polarizing, and people think this is just some sort of abstract sort of about language, or that we need to make sure that we're not staying too much in just the abstract terminology, and helping people understand that the reason this matters is because it has a real impact on people's lives, and that there are individuals whose lives have been significantly harmed and disrupted as a result of these practices, and that's why it's wrong. It's not a political sort of attempt to make everybody one way, or it's not it's about trying to create a city where we don't, or communities where we don't harm one another, and just sort of have the focus on being able to tell that story in a way that people understand it, and that takes it out of the academic in a way. I mean, or out of just the intellectual, because that's what impacted me. When people shared, this is what this means for me. It's because I hear the Jordan Petersons of the world and other people out there that sort of try and make this about intellectual ideas, or these moralistic kind of I feel like I'm going to use the wrong words here, but the education, I think, needs to be, this is about people harming people, and we all know that's not the kind of community we want to be in, and this can be what that harm looks like, and this is why we can be better as a society, and to create a space that people can kind of understand, so that it's not as much a polarized discussion, a polarized political discussion, I guess. So that's my thoughts on that, Rory, in terms of how do we make sure people know what we're talking about and why it matters to people.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all of that. In terms of religious settings, faith-based settings, I think, like I said, the more progressive churches certainly would be interested in exploring more what the implications of this ban means for other people of faith, and exploring collaborative efforts to champion and enact it in some ways. And then, of course, our more conservative brothers and sisters would have a very different take on it, right? In my many years of experience in navigating the various theological perspectives on human sexuality, there's some people who simply cannot see how this is harmful, right? And at most, you can provide baseline information about this bylaw, and what the implications are, but the challenge really rests on people to learn and to be educated, right? So, how I see that taking shape, ultimately it's the stories, as Mayor Clark said, that will change how we understand this issue, right? It was the truth of the residential schools that gave birth to the notion of reconciliation here in Canada, right? And similarly, I think there needs to be some truth telling inside our churches as well, right? And so, with that, I've mused with a former professor of mine on exploring what an informal inquiry or forum or story capturing event would look like to gather 2S LGBTQ people to help tell their stories, right? And in the Mennonite context, we saw that taking place, being led by one of our denominational schools, right? That we create space that's led by 2S LGBTQ people to share their stories, to have kind of a truth telling and begin to start forming some reconciliation around this. But if we wanted to scope it out into with other larger denominational partners, we could, but but yeah, that's one very practical way I've always thought, I've envisioned that taking place, because that would be that reckoning for us to kind of understand the true implications of conversion therapy and systemic homophobia inside the churches, right? And yeah, I think that's my point on that for sure.
I agree wholeheartedly with both of you and Ben with your comments about the truth telling, the humanity, the real life implications that are in no way political. And kind of harkens back to or seeing wearing masks to protect other people as being political right now. And it's kind of hard for me to imagine getting rid of that polarization right now in the current climate, but I really hope that we can work towards that. And I think a big step is putting faces and real stories in front of real people and having a conversation and dialogue about the harms that this has caused and continues to cause for people.
Thank you. And I think, oh, I apologize. Sorry, Mayor Clark.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just quickly to add that for it, this conversation did sort of feel a bit abstract when we first started talking about it, and I'm not somebody who has experienced conversion therapy, and in so many of these different cases, it's really coming to light to me the importance of having the people who don't have the lived experience of something take a step back and listen to the people who do, and how do we create a space for that to happen, because that is one of the ways that it's less abstract, you know, and that's a difficult thing. That's the kind of core of systemic racism and discrimination, you know, that I think we're grappling with as a society, is that there's a lot of people in positions of decision-making power and so on who don't actually, haven't experienced why and how this matters to people, and then actually the way this whole issue played out really just hit me in the face in that way, and because it was kind of abstract, and then we started talking to people, and then I had a chance to have more direct conversations with people who were reminding me of just how much this mattered, in a way that I just didn't, you know, it wasn't as clear to me until I heard directly. And that's, I think, a key lesson is how as a society do we ensure that that there's a way of ensuring that lived experience of something is central in helping us understand what the right way forward is.
Thank you. And I think that's a wonderful, I certainly echo that sentiment, and that's why conversations like these are so important, and we're so, again, so grateful to the three of you. Because we are way ahead of time, you are all far too polite, and so we wondered if you had any questions for each other.
Well, I'm interested in learning more about Calgary. Like, how is it playing out in your community, whether it's conversion therapy or just this? You've had a chance to hear about Saskatoon. It's always valuable to kind of hear the perspective of where are the wins in Calgary these days, and what are the things that you feel proud of or that are challenging. Since we've got you here, and it's a neighboring city, and Jill, that I know you have history here in Saskatchewan too, so I'm going to throw that out there.
Well, thank you, Mayor Clark. I think, honestly, I hadn't been paying much attention, embarrassingly, to how the conversion therapy ban was going here. I knew that it passed. As a member of the queer, gender diverse community, I was really happy with that news. Similarly, when I saw it pass in Vancouver. And as a lawyer, I understand the constraints that are necessary. I'm not a human rights lawyer or a municipal lawyer, but I understand the background constraints that each city faces. For me as a member of the community and hearing from other LGBTQ plus community members, the symbolism of it was very important, not only for Calgarians, but for others in nearby communities, just sort of as a beacon in Southern Alberta, inclusive place. That's been very important. I've been very proud to be a Calgarian when that happened, and I'm sure everyone in the Saskatoon community feels the same. So I don't know honestly how things are going enforcement-wise. I know that the resources are there and it appears to be accessible in terms of making a complaint if one would like to. So that was good to see. The website's all up to date. It's got a Q&A section on what constitutes conversion therapy, how does that fit into the parameters of freedom of religion. I don't have it in front of me right now, but it was informative. It was very clear that for gender affirming type therapy, that wasn't geared towards promoting heterosexuality, that these types of parameters don't apply. And I thought that was a win and really, really good to see, and to see that those resources are easily accessible to individuals wondering about conversion therapy and wondering how to report instances of it. Yeah, otherwise, Calgary is a good place that gets too much snow, much like Saskatoon. So that's not a win.
So if there aren't any other, oh, sorry, Joe.
I just had a question for the panel generally, either Ben or Charlie or Rory or Ciara. I find, Ben, your comments about reconciliation and residential schools and those stories being what really resonated and started that reconciliation process. I guess I'm always concerned about the victims being further victimized by the process. And while we're talking about bridge making and really hitting home the humanity of the harms that are perpetuated by conversion therapy, how can we get those stakeholders, those victims, to be involved, to put themselves out there without further harming themselves?
I think that's a really essential question to thinking about whether there's sort of a question of someone's identity or the validity of someone's identity, whether their experiences are something that are going to be at threat ultimately through those spaces as well. Questioning whether someone's experiences are legitimately harmful or not. I think that's kind of what comes into play in these types of conversations. What is this actually harmful or not is something that's often asked, and is often put into that place of it not being. Hence why we don't want to put these bans in place. So yeah, it is a important question. I'm not even putting someone into a position where they have to face the brunt of being delegitimized in their experiences and their identities and their lives.
Maybe I can pop in here. Thank you, everyone. I've really been enjoying this conversation, and that particular, especially with a lot of the conversation that has come up about truth telling, right? And how it's those sometimes small conversations, sometimes small group, one-on-one. I mean, sometimes those are the most powerful. We know that from sometimes those are the most powerful dialogues. But absolutely, the expectation for those that have gone through it to be the ones at the front all of the time is really tough. And I mean, we're seeing that in some neighboring cities as well, where people that are speaking out against or drawing attention to the harms of conversion therapy don't have the support they need around them to be able to tell those stories safely. And so that would be a piece that comes to mind, Jill, in your question is we've definitely heard from every panelist that there's such a value in, and we know the lived experience is the place that we need to start from. So how do we create safe spaces in which to listen?
You really stumped me. And I'm the man of many words, but you really stumped me on that one. You know, I just that really makes me reflect on. So I was very fortunate to go to Ottawa for the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Report in 2015 with Mennonite Central Committee. And, you know, I got to sit in some of those circles. I mean, honorary witness to people's stories, right? And just sitting there in silence and observing without asking questions, but just watching them share with each other and witnessing that conversation was a very transformational experience, both for me just generally, but also as an Indigenous person as well, right? That was, and it helped me understand my own history in such better way. So yeah, I think it would have to be a very intentional practice, one that doesn't necessarily have to be large scale, but as Rachel kind of alluded to, small groups are a great way. I'm part of Generous Spaces here in Saskatoon, and you know, even the story sharing that happens there, just hearing from folks around the province, it's truly amazing. And sometimes it's just fun, you know, lighthearted conversation, but other times it's like, you know, wow, that hearing someone's experience and lived experience, it just truly changes you, right? So I don't know, it, you know, start small, but dream, right? And see kind of where it goes. But yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely stumped me a little bit.
Yeah, I admittedly during this process, because I'm a mediator at heart. That's like what I was doing before I, you know, got into city council, and I went to Menno Simons College in Winnipeg, Ben, it's a sister organization to CMU. And, you know, you sort of think, well, let's just get people together and talk, right? And even when I had the experience of talking to some of the churches that were concerned about this bylaw and who had said, you know, we'd be interested in conversation. You know, I at first thought, well, maybe maybe there's a way to just get the different parties together and, you know, and have a conversation about that. But when I talked to people who are in leadership in the 2S LGBTQ community, you know, I realized that, you know, we have to do this in steps, and it's not a, you know, there has to be safety, and it's something that you can't just assume, you know, is going to be, it has to be the right setting. And I don't want to try and speak for either or any of those bodies, but as somebody who, again, was not dealing from a place of my own experience, I think had a bit of a naive kind of idea that of how you can create that opportunity, and I think it's still possible, but I think it needs to be determined by the different parties, and particularly the parties affected, what safety means and what it looks like. And to the question around truth and reconciliation, I mean, in my experience, I've just been in awe of residential school survivors who are in settings where they, and we have some you know, remarkable elders and survivors in Saskatoon who share their stories and experiences in so many settings and so many situations to help try and educate. And sometimes it lands in people and it changes hearts and minds, and other times I can tell that they've done that sharing and it people aren't ready for it, or that it doesn't lead to the kind of understanding that you'd hope for. I do think, though, that I've also learned that the power of creating a setting where you take off your status and your roles, and like you sit in a circle and you speak to one another as human beings first, we have too many formal settings that are too structured and set up in a way where the roles and the sort of procedures outweigh the humanity and the ability to probably to learn from each other in the way that some of this understanding comes from. And I think we can learn from, from some of those same elders and survivors about what it takes, to open people's hearts and minds to have those conversations.
Yeah, that is very right. Like, obviously, such a good point. And further to this conversation, we do sometimes, and I'll say I'm guilty of it too, we shy away from talking about churches, right? We do. We shy away from talking about the religious communities, and because it's hard, right? I mean, all of the conversations are hard, but with something like this, I mean, how powerful and important for everybody to be reminded and to hear that, because we know that this happens a lot within faith contexts. And so how powerful to hear that religious communities, faith communities do not want to be left out of the conversation, right? When thinking about, yes, we know there are a lot of affirming churches. And now I think that now that the bylaw is in place, as I'm listening to this conversation, that is really the next step. One of the biggest next steps is, okay, so we have a bylaw banning business practice, and it's very clear that the elephant in the room is that this is the next layer of the conversation, is actually engaging with religious communities. Again, I don't know how to do that, but I really want to say that, right? And to hear that and to start thinking about how we do that, because it's important work. And I know as well that there are a lot of people that want to be involved in that work on all sides. Not that there are sides to that particular conversation.
Thank you, Professor Walker. And I agree. It almost feels like churches, because churches are so synonymous with family and tradition. It's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people. But I almost liken it to like a well-meaning grandparent. They may be from a different generation, but they might still really want to be on board. So inviting everyone to the table is so important. I did have a few messages in our chat, and I wondered if the panelists would be comfortable if we opened up the chat to questions. And I'll just say to our audience members today, we're going to stay away from questions about bike lanes or other issues. Our panelists today have come here today to talk about the conversion therapy ban. So I'll just respectfully ask that we stay on track. So if panelists are comfortable, I could open that up.
I'm happy to hear from any of the other panelists' opinions on bike lanes. Just kidding.
So our first question was, are there any coordinated and cooperative efforts being taken in Saskatoon to promote change for other levels of government as it relates to banning conversion therapy?
Well,
from my perspective, not that I know of.
Coordinated and cooperative efforts being taken. So is that question in terms of within the community or within the municipal government? And I guess it's coming from somebody in the chat, so I have to interpret it. Well,
I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I'm guessing it's community-based. Would that be everyone's interpretation? Yeah, we'll go with community. And then welcome to correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sure myself. I mean, I know obviously that Regina is now going through this, and so I'm assuming some of that discussion between members of, in the 2S LGBT community here in Regina, and sort of in that's what's kind of impressive about Alberta is I think I heard a stat at one point that something like 75% of citizens in Alberta live in communities that have banned conversion therapy. Like the Yeah, Jill, I'm just letting you know here that the number of municipalities that passed the bylaw, which is kind of incredible, given that it's not, no offense, but that's not, Alberta wouldn't have been the province that I would have picked as a leader in that, and so I think it's good that there's a conversation happening in Regina, although it sounds like it's been also painful at times too. So, but I know there has been, we reached out to the provincial government and actually got a letter from, at the time, Attorney General Wyant back that outlined that the provincial government also believes this is inappropriate and harmful practice and not something that the government supports. And so, but other than that, I'm not aware of any other specifics.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. The second question we had, and I don't think that they're asking for any names or anything, but the question just was, had there been pushback to the bylaw?
I can probably speak to that too. Yes, there was in particular a number of different representatives from a number of different denominations of churches who felt that the language in the bylaw was not specific enough and did not wasn't specifically targeted towards the language towards sort of the coercive and harmful practices because we followed and adopted the same language that the federal government and other municipalities, the same as I understand it, critiques exist in those jurisdictions, and so there was a number of different concerns brought forward, and people who criticized the bylaw from that standpoint. Although on the night of the bylaw coming to council, everybody who spoke in favor of the bylaw. So it was actually interesting to see that it felt like there was a significant amount of support in the community to do this, and there was, some quite concentrated and specific leaders who expressed concerns about it. So it was contentious, and it also had a lot of community support from everything I could see.
I have a question. Sorry if there's others in the question in the chat. But I'm curious, just in terms of when we're looking at the prohibition and sort of consequences end of things. If, for example, an individual is being charged, there may be more of a direct association there. If it's an organization, there may not be able to be that direct located sort of person responsible. But when we have a penalty incurred, so for example, a bylaw stated is $10,000 to the amount as a maximum, or if there's a federal ban and there's certain charges laid there, I'm wondering about how those funds are being used, or if they're siphoned into a particular direction to benefit the individuals that have received that harm, or if that's something that is located within a place of just sort of being integrated back into the municipality or the provincial government or the federal government at large. And obviously there's some things that are conjecture, but I would be curious at least where the city stands.
I'll give that question to Ben. I'm sure he can answer. I think that one's for me. That's an interesting question, actually. We that is not something that at the municipal level was discussed when it comes to fines, and they're generally they go into general revenue. Although when it comes to, and I can't speak to the federal context or whether or not there's the creation at the federal level of any fund. But when people get photo radar tickets or red light camera tickets, we actually do sort of direct and make sure that an equivalent amount of funding of as to what is collected from those tickets goes into traffic safety in neighborhoods. So we direct it towards improving crosswalks, putting up pedestrian signals, you know, doing those things. And so there is a practice, there is a precedent for, you know, making sure that you redirect those funds into that. But that has not been, and as I said, I don't think we're in a situation where there has been a lot in like Vancouver was the first city to implement this in 2000, I forget what it was, 17 or 16. So they've been 4 years in or something. And I don't believe there's been a lot of actual fines levied or a lot of, you know, that direct sort of pooling of those funds accumulated. But that's the context for that one.
Yeah, Rory, you looked into some of the context around Vancouver. So did you find anything, or Jill, have you heard of anything to that effect in Calgary?
I haven't seen anything, I think, and that was where our curiosity was stemming from the federal ban, because I think that's where we're seeing even just the limitations, restrictions. It's if there's someone who's consensually agreeing to conversion therapy, they're able to receive it. And if somebody's having private conversations, be it with faith leaders or schools, educators or friends or family, there are no prohibitions to that extent. And so when we're looking at the realm of what those penalties are, what is that going to feed back into? I think as we talk about reconciliatory efforts and work there, there's significant harms that people then have to pay for therapy. They have to go through these financially burdensome experiences after the fact. And so I think that's where that question lies for me is, what are those measures being taken to enforce sort of a process for people to find healing or to work through that process themselves in a way that they don't have to still face that financial burden.
Yeah, Professor Walker, I wasn't able to find or get an answer yet from the City of Calgary about enforcement. I expect their Q&A sheet, which I don't have before me, might speak to where funds from any penalties would be directed. And Rory, I think that's an excellent idea, is to divert it back to the community that suffered the harm, whether it be pride programs or some sort of a counseling fund. That's a fabulous idea. So if it's not there, I might be pitching it to Calgary.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Were there any closing remarks from any of the panelists? I realize, again, we've asked a lot of you on a topic that's so new, particularly in our city. So
I think this is just a fabulous opportunity to engage with all you folks on this topic. I really appreciate that, and I look forward to engaging in this conversation again down the road when it hits some of the churches and we start, you know, wrestling with what this means. I know that for us it's an easy sell at Wildwood, so that's all good. But I am curious to see how this conversation will take place, and I'm looking forward to being a part of it.
Go ahead, Mayor Clark.
Pretty sure you were first with your button.
All right, well, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for having me as part of this very important dialogue, and I look forward to continuing it with residents of Saskatoon and throughout Alberta and the Prairie provinces. Thank you.
And I want to thank you, Dr. Loewen Walker, I think, for helping to initiate this, and Ciara and Rory with your really great work. And I guess it was as students you sort of brought this forward, and so you've done a great job of really thoughtfully, developing some questions. And to Jill and to Ben, it's been great to hear your perspective. Going through a debate at City Council is one venue, right? And it's very structured and heightened. And I've actually, you know, there's a lot to learn about this, and I'm still learning a lot about it. And so one of the reasons I thought it would be valuable to participate is so that I could hear a little bit more of where to from here, and how is this playing out, and for people who are working within or living within the 2S LGBTQ community, what are people hoping for? So this is how I think, and because there's a lot of nuance, having these types of venues to discuss these issues is a way that we become smarter and better and find that way forward as a community. So thank you very much. It's been great, and to the university for hosting this. I've really enjoyed it and appreciated a chance to be part of it.
Thank you. I definitely, you know, we know that there are complicated harms, right? And so I think that something that came up in the conversation too is that the issue that bubbles up is often the tip of the iceberg. And so the reminder that there are still systems in place which enable such things as conversion therapy, and in whatever ways that it is being sold very, you know, publicly, but also secretly behind closed doors. And so I know that was absolutely the intent for this talk, was saying celebrate the wins, right? We all talked about how incredible it is that this has taken place. We know that in Regina they're still grappling with this issue, but for Saskatoon to have the bylaw in place, wonderful, has a very educational function. And don't let the balls drop, right? There's still work to be done. And I think that actually I have a list of very specific things that we can get to work on. So I'll be calling all of you and look forward to keeping that going, because the appetite is there, and now is the time to keep working on these issues. So with that, I want to say thank you to our panelists, and to our audience for joining us today. There's wonderful thank yous in the chat here. People have really appreciated this conversation. A great nuance to the discussion. I want to thank Shannon and Sarah from the College of Law for helping behind the scenes for all of these discussions. This is the third Zoom panel. I have never hosted a Zoom lecture series, and it went flawlessly and was really a delight. And so all three of the lectures will be available on the College of Law website, and I encourage everyone to take a look at all of them. It's been quite an incredible experience. Rory and Ciara, thank you for helping with all of the talks, in particular for developing and moderating today's panel. I'm so excited to see the two of you become the incredible lawyers that you will be in our society and do the great things that you have yet to do. And then last but not least, of course, to our panelists. It was already said, but we somehow ended up with such a wonderful cross-section of experience and sector knowledge. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I know that's what we had hoped, and you delivered much more than we had hoped. So thank you to Mayor Charlie Clark, to Ben Borne, and to Sill Bishop. I hope to speak to all of you about this more in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Walker. This was her initiative, and you've worked so hard, so thank you.
Just great. Thank you. So that's wonderful. Do I just, oh.